If you've had eyes and ears, and you've been in public in the last 30 or so days, you may have caught wind that a certain somebody is coming to town. You may have heard that he sees you when you're sleeping, you might have heard rumor about his list, you might have even seen him in your local mall speaking to children. This fella is known by many names, from Kris Kringle to Saint Nick, but he's best known as Santa Claus. Out of all of our many varied Christmas traditions, Santa Claus might just be the most unavoidable. He appears in advertising, in marketing, in songs, in stories, and yet he might not be quite as monolithic as you might think. He was actually invented relatively recently, but Santa Claus was pulled out of a much older soup of confusing, contradicting, and oftentimes just weird December traditions. Today, as we prepare for Christmas, I want to sit by my fake fireplace here and talk to you about Santa Claus, where he came from, who he is today, and why he might be one of the most important personifications of our modern culture. This is your final warning that if there are any children in the room, aside from our friends right here, you're probably going to want to escort them out now before I start talking about witches with knives, pickled children, and the reality of our old pal Kris Kringle. I'm sure that we've all heard Santa be referred to as Saint Nick, and you might quite reasonably extrapolate from that he is Saint Nicholas. And while that is true, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And a lot of this complexity arises from the fact that Saint Nicholas himself is almost just as much of a myth as Santa Claus. A Nicholas of Myra almost certainly existed. We have church records recording his existence, but beyond that, we have almost no facts about his life. The information that we do have was written with its own biases, with its own ulterior motives, and was most likely written over 500 years after he actually lived. So all of that being said, the things that I'm about to tell you about St. Nicholas are almost entirely likely legends rather than facts. But you should never underestimate the power of a good story. Saint Nicholas was likely born around 260 AD in the port city of Patara, located in modern-day Turkey. He was born to well-off Christian parents, was baptized as an infant, and from a very early age, he showed an affinity for religion. In some stories, he even performed miracles as an infant. He grew up very firm in his faith, and this led to him, once he was an adult, being elected the Bishop of Myra. As the Bishop of Myra, St. Nicholas more than likely took part in the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, a landmark moment in Christian history. The Council of Nicaea established a lot of the base guidelines for Christianity, including the date of Easter, the protocol for baptizing and ordaining new priests, and it settled a lot of heresies of the day, including Arianism. Now, this isn't a theology lesson, so I'm going to try and be brief, but Arianism was a belief perpetuated by a man named Arius, who thought that Jesus, the Son of God, was born after God, the Father, and was thus in some way beneath him. This was in opposition to more traditional thinkers who believed in the Trinity, in which all three parts of God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, were equal and consubstantial, of the same substance. Nicholas was one of these more traditional thinkers, and as the tales would have it, he was not pleased by Arius's assertions. In one version of the story, after hearing Arius spout out this heresy, Nicholas picked up a brick, made a theological argument about the Trinity with it, and then it promptly burst into flames, dripping down between his fingers until there was nothing but dust left. In another telling, he got so upset that he hit Arius in the face, was imprisoned, because that wasn't a cool thing to do, and then had to be bailed out by the baby Jesus and Mary. Now, this might not sound like the jolly old Saint Nick of our childhood recollections, and that's because he wasn't. The earliest stories that we have about St. Nicholas have almost nothing to do with our modern perception of Santa Claus, but there was one really important place where their stories lined up. Nicholas was known as a protector of many things, but most importantly, he was a protector of children. Stories emerged of him helping infertile couples conceive and then protecting these children, sometimes performing miracles in order to save them from harm. In one particularly gruesome legend, 3 lost boys are lured into a butcher shop by a butcher, whereupon he cut them up for meat and put them in pickle barrels to sell. Saint Nick noticed something was up, rescued the boys, put them back together, and resurrected them, and then punished the butcher. Perhaps the most famous tale involves a poor father who is so poor that he's considering selling his 3 daughters to prostitution. Saint Nick overhears their plight, and so he tosses a bag of coins through the window. He listens as they discover this money, and they rejoice, seeing it as a gift from God. The next 2 nights, Saint Nick continued throwing bags of coins through their window until they had enough money for all 3 daughters to be married off to the men of their choosing. In some versions of the story, the money lands in their shoes where they find it the next morning, or in some cases, it even lands in their stockings, hanging over the fire to dry. The man eventually catches St. Nicholas in the act, and he thanks him effusively. But St. Nick then redirected the man's thanks to God, and he made the man promise not to share the story of what St. Nick had done until after his death. This set a precedent for the type of generosity that St. Nick was known for. First off, it was targeted. It was responding to a specific need for a specific person. Second off, it was anonymous. He didn't want to be recognized or thanked for the gifts he was giving. And finally, the gifts that he bestowed showed the way that simple generosity could be transformed into something miraculous. St. Nicholas probably died somewhere around 335, but death was not the end for him. In fact, you could argue it was just the beginning. Tales of St. Nicholas and his miracles began to spread, and he was seen as the patron saint and protector of a lot of different things: farmers, sailors, and of course, children. Churches were built in his name, his remains were shipped and traded all across Europe, seen as very holy relics, and hagiographers wrote extensive records of his life, his miracles, and his times. And it is significant that these accounts were written not as biographies, but as hagiographies, records of the lives of saints, written specifically to draw people closer to God, rather than to present raw facts. But real or not, tales of St. Nicholas and his miracles spread like wildfire across Europe, particularly taking root in Eastern European and Slavic countries, with its dense population of farmers and sailors. He was especially remembered on December 6th, his supposed death day and his feast day, and it became a tradition to leave your socks or stockings out on the eve of December 6th, and you might wake up with a gift from St. Nicholas inside them, just like the father and his daughters did. St. Nicholas came to be one of the best known and most widely beloved saints, at one point having more churches dedicated to him than the actual apostles of Jesus Christ. But all of this St. Nick hype would hit a wall in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th and 17th centuries. One of the most impactful teachings of Martin Luther, the founding father of Protestantism, was the decentering of saints within Christian worship. He didn't see the point of going through an intercessor if, the big guy was available to take your call. This meant that St. Nicholas and the traditions that had developed around him were no longer cool for a lot of the population of Europe. But it's never quite as simple as just telling people to stop. Celebrations of St. Nicholas, feasts like that of the Holy Fools, of the Holy Innocents, even the celebration of Christmas were deeply ingrained in our culture at this point, having been developed from way older pagan celebrations during the Yuletide time. And it wasn't going to be so easy for people to forget the revelries of December. So we needed a solution for this, and in places like Puritan New England, they went for the more direct route of banning the celebration of Christmas wholesale, but in many areas in Europe, they went for the method of substitution. Some people decided to swap out St. Nicholas for the Christ child, and to move this celebration up to the 25th, to the celebration of Jesus' birth, meaning that on Christmas Eve, the Christ child himself would come into your home to deliver gifts. But there were a couple problems with this. Some people thought that having gifts at Christmas time devalued the holiness of the celebration, a problem that we're still having today. Plus, the idea of a little baby Jesus in a nightgown just didn't have the same kind of pizzazz as Saint Nick. They wanted their kindly old bishop, not this strange little boy, and so in some places, we actually see these two traditions combining, and Saint Nicholas and baby Jesus would go together to deliver presents. In other places, especially Central and Eastern Europe, they took the Saint Nicholas tradition and just went wild with it, inventing and reinventing a whole slew of very nearly pagan creatures that trod the streets in December. The most iconic of these, of course, is Krampus. A strange combination of goat and man, Krampus was known to arrive before Christmas with a big burlap sack, but his didn't contain gifts and goodies. Krampus would abscond with naughty children, stuffing them into his sack and taking them away to his cave in the wilderness, where he would eat them. He actually very often worked in conjunction with Saint Nick, doing his dirty work, purifying the kids so that only the good ones were left to receive gifts and goodies. Krampus is a bit of an oddity. He seems very bizarre, but it starts to make sense when you think about the fact that in the 16th and 17th century, the devil was becoming a big deal, along with his whole pile of demonic entities. Stories were going around of cloven hooves, horns, and cannibalism, and Krampus took on a lot of these devilish qualities, including the idea of punishing evildoers in service of the greater good. We also saw less devilish Christmas companions emerge, such as Belsnickel, a ragged man in furs who would come into your home before Christmas time to test your children. He'd leave out sweets, and the kids that impatiently grabbed at them would be taken out back and beaten with a switch. Once again, this was a corrective measure, having kids fix their behavior so that by the time St. Nicholas came around, everyone could revel in the joy of his gifts. As early as the 13th century, Icelandic stories told of the Grýla, a wicked crone in the wilderness with a long curved knife, who would disembowel children that complained too much. She was sometimes accompanied by her pet, the Yule cat, who would hunt down and eat lazy workers. Christmas time was the season to get yourself in order, or else. In later stories, the Grýla was also the mother of the 13 Yule lads, who would show up to your home upon their predetermined date, each wreaking their own kind of havoc. They each have their own tasks, their own kinds of mischief, which I will put up on the screen right here if you want to pause and really take it all in. But I think my favorites are the spoon licker, who's incredibly emaciated because he only eats when he gets to lick your spoons. We also have the candle eater, who would eat your candles, and then the yogurt eater, who would gobble up all of your Icelandic yogurt. As of the 20th, when this video is coming out, the yogurt gobbler did just show up, so be sure to keep an eye on your fermented dairy products. But around this time of year, you should also be watching out for the door slammer and Stubby, because they also should still be around, so keep yourself safe from the Yule lads this year. But if the Yule Lads have ruined your Christmas feast and you need something to eat, you should check out this video's sponsor, Factor. I'll admit, it can be difficult during the busy holiday season to get in your square 7 meals a day, but Factor makes meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals directly to your doorstep. Factor takes the stress out of meal planning by letting you skip the grocery stores, the food prep, and the cooking fatigue. Instead of dealing with all that stress in an already stressful time, you can get chef-created meals delivered right to your door. They give you over 35 meals to choose from per week, including options like keto, calorie smart, vegan and veggie, and more. I think my favorite Factor meal that I've tried was their honey mustard chicken. It comes with green beans and potatoes, and it smelled so good that I ate it hunched over my stove like an animal because I just couldn't wait to sit down. I really love just how flexible Factor can be. You can change up your order whenever you need to, with plans from 4 to 18 meals per week, and you can pause and reschedule your deliveries anytime. I love cooking, but I do struggle to keep on top of it when I'm really busy, and Factor helps fill in those gaps and helps me maintain a healthy lifestyle. If you want to give Factor a try, head on down to the link in my description to get 50% off and free shipping on your first Factor box, plus 20% off on next month's order using my code JESS50. Thank you so much to Factor for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. This is a side tangent completely, but I know that the elf on the shelf is a really big thing right now, and I don't like him. I don't like the way he looks or the way he is, so I would like to propose that instead new parents begin implementing the Yule Lads arriving and causing mischief. So if any new parents need ideas on how to make that happen, let me know, because I've got a lot of ideas going on up here. Other Christmas beasts included the Tomte, a little elf gnome creature that would help you with your household chores if you were good, but would cause mischief if you were being lazy. In order to appease the Tomte, you were supposed to leave out a special bowl of rice pudding for them to enjoy before you went to bed. France gave us Père Fouettard. Sorry about the pronunciation, French is a terrifying language, but that translates to Father Whipper, and he would follow Saint Nick around to whip kids. Interestingly, his backstory, as long as you've been paying attention, is gonna sound a bit familiar. Père Fouettard was once a butcher, and 3 lost boys came into his shop, where he cut them up, killed them, obviously, and put them in pickling barrels to sell. Saint Nick came along, resurrected the boys, and punished Père Fouettard by forcing him to follow Saint Nick around for the rest of his immortal life, dealing out his judgment, whipping children. Which, honestly, for this guy, it doesn't seem like it would be that much of a punishment, but who am I to judge the judgments of St. Nicholas? There was a definite idea across a lot of Europe at this time that Christmas was the season for purifying. The gifts of good St. Nicholas were to be earned, and so you had to correct behavior first. Sure, you had to threaten kids for it to work, but it seems like it worked. But it wasn't just creepy little Christmas guys popping up at this time. We also got, in some cases, replacements for St. Nicholas. In Germany, we had the Weihnachtsmann, Finland gave us Old Man Winter, and of course, perhaps most famously, England came up with Father Christmas. In his original incarnations, Father Christmas actually had nothing to do with St. Nicholas. He first showed up in the 15th century as Sir Christ Mas, telling people to be jolly for the birth of Jesus Christ. In 1616, Ben Jonson personified him as an old man with a long beard and many children showing up at a party to protest the Protestant suppression of the Christmas holiday. From there, across the next 200-300 odd years, Father Christmas would appear often in plays and masks and carols, representing a more adult form of Christmas celebration. He wasn't necessarily there for the kids, he was there to celebrate the drinking, the dancing, and the parties. But by the early 1800s, Christmas had undergone a serious transformation. Once it had been a big communal celebration, a time for debauchery and wild revelry, but between changing cultural values and religious suppression, this had fallen out of favor. It was a solemn holiday, a religious observance, and there wasn't really room for Santa Claus. If anything, there was Saint Nick, but it wasn't anything recognizable to what we have today. It was in America, with its rich density of German and Dutch immigrants in the Northeast, that Santa Claus, as we know him, would finally take shape. And it's kind of funny, because as much as we like to imagine that myths and these popular cultural figures come about organically, Santa Claus was actually invented by a room of guys sitting down and saying, we need to invent something like Santa Claus. They wanted a mascot for the holiday. The main player here is John Pintard, a member of the New York Historical Society, and he became very fixated on this concept of a traditional Christmas. In his letters, Pintard regularly expressed nostalgia for what he called the old customs and ancient usages of New York, and particularly for the forgotten spirit of the old Christmas season, when rich folk and poor, old and young, would mingle together in genial harmony in the streets of the city. Pintard would spend over 20 years trying on different Christmas celebrations for size, in some cases resurrecting older celebration techniques, and in some cases inventing entirely new ones, in the name of these older traditions. On St. Nicholas's Day in 1810, he hosted a banquet in honor of the feast, including printing out pamphlets with a depiction of St. Nicholas with the subtitle Santa Claus. Now, this certainly didn't turn Santa into a household staple, but it did put the name of Santa Claus into the minds of New York elites. One of these elites was Washington Irving, best known for his stories Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In his satirical piece, Knickerbocker's History of New York, Santa Claus is brought up multiple times in association with Christmas. He even describes, St. Nicholas came riding over the tops of trees in that self-same wagon wherein he brings his yearly presents to children. Saint Nick, or Santa Claus, was becoming a new tradition, in the guise of something much older, but he wouldn't really take shape until 1823's A Visit from St. Nicholas, better known as The Night Before Christmas. Published anonymously originally, this poem would absolutely define a new generation's Santa Claus. It opens with the lines, "'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that Saint Nicholas soon would be there." It goes on to describe what we would all consider staple Santa qualities: the flushed cheeks, the jolly demeanor, the reindeer, Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, and so on and so forth. This poem made Saint Nick a specifically Christmas thing. It gave him his shape, transforming him from a stern old bishop to a jolly little elf. The authorship of this poem is highly debated, but what cannot be debated is the sheer importance of this poem when it comes to shaping our current conceptions of Santa Claus. From here, Santa Claus grew fairly organically. It helped that he was so flexible. He was kind of a wider umbrella under which a lot of Santa-esque creatures and their associated traditions could be absorbed. Father Christmas and Old Man Winter became Santa Claus. It was easy enough for Krampus and Belsnickel to follow around Santa Claus rather than Saint Nick. It was just as easy to leave out stockings for Santa Claus as it was for Saint Nick. You could leave out porridge or even milk and cookies for him like you would have the Tomte. Santa Claus incorporated beautifully into worldwide existing traditions, and it's his flexibility as a symbolic figure that allowed him to thrive. Once he was established by the 1820s or so, Santa began to appear everywhere. In literature, in art, in advertising, and in propaganda. One artist who really brought him to life was Thomas Nast, illustrating for Harper's Weekly. In 1862, he drew from the Christmas imaginings of his Bavarian upbringing, creating a Santa that brought Christmas cheer to Union soldiers. Nast would continue these Christmas-time Santa illustrations for the next 23 years, but it was in 1881 that he created his most iconic depiction yet. While this illustration might seem pretty traditional from our perspective, it's important to note that Nast was first and foremost a political cartoonist, and there's a lot of symbolism wrapped up in this image. Nast was speaking out against the government's underpaying of soldiers. Santa isn't carrying a sack of presents on his back, he's wearing the backpack of an enlisted man. He's carrying a dress sword, and you could even read the toy horse that he carries as a Trojan horse, a call-out of the treachery of the government. Even from his earliest days, Santa wasn't just a deity of good cheer and seasonal happiness. He could be used as a potent tool. And in his role as an equalizer, bringing gifts to good children no matter their financial status, Santa became a very important symbol as poverty grew rampant during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution represented a complete transformation of human life on Earth. No longer were we an agrarian society, as we had been since the very beginning of civilization. The manner and requirements of work had changed. The family structure was permanently altered. And with all of this, the way that we interacted with the seasons for thousands of years changed completely. Like I said, we used to farm, and when you farm, you follow the rhythm of the seasons. This is why we had celebrations in mid to late December. The growing season was done, the harvest had been gathered in, the animals that wouldn't survive the winter had been freshly slaughtered. December was the one chance you had to kick back your feet and let loose before winter tightened your belts once more. But now, with more and more and more people working in factories and cities rather than in farms, this had all changed. Christmas was a time when people were being laid off, when time off meant no money and thus no food, no warmth, no housing. There was a huge poverty crisis at the time, as the rich got richer and the poor just got poorer. By the mid-1800s, Christmas had returned from its Puritan exile, but it had taken on a more domestic form than ever before. The movers and shakers of Christmas, such as John Pintard, had taken Christmas away from its roots of being a large-scale community celebration, celebrated on city streets and in large halls, to being something much more private, something celebrated domestically in the home. Queen Victoria popularized the indoor Christmas tree, and nuclear families huddled close around their delicious Christmas dinners. But these were the kind of celebratory luxuries simply not allowed for the poor. But the figure of Santa Claus could act as a very important reminder that Christmas joy is not something that should be reserved for the rich. After all, Santa Claus didn't care about your financial status. He could go down any chimney, and if we look all the way back to the radical generosity of St. Nicholas, there was a pretty firm basis for Santa being a sign of generosity, a sign that you should not ignore the poor and unfortunate at this time of year. Okay, one of my lights just went out, and I can't get it to turn back on, so I had to switch it out, and now the lighting is gonna be different, and it might be bad, but what are you gonna do? Despite all of the charitable implications of Santa, he was also being used as a tool for commercialism. As early as the 1820s, stores capitalized on the gift-giving traditions that had developed around Christmas, having and advertising special Christmas sales. By the 1840s, these advertisements were making use of the iconic Santa Claus image to push sales, especially to their younger clientele. In 1841, a Philadelphia shop had the great idea of setting up a life-sized model of Santa Claus, and children and adults far and wide came in to see this spectacle. This quickly evolved into having real live Santa impersonators in shops, making great memories for kids and pushing sales for the hosting shops. But it wasn't all crass consumerism. By the 1890s, organizations like the Salvation Army were dressing up unemployed men as Santa Claus and sending them out on the streets to capitalize on people's Christmas-time charity and gather donations for the organization. A really interesting duality emerges here. On the one hand, Santa Claus is a figure of almost radical charity, of anonymous generosity, but he also represents a growing wave of consumerism, commercialism, and anesthetizing of the holiday. These dual conflicting purposes wouldn't budge anywhere even as we move into the 20th century. Amidst the chaos and calamity of the First World War, word spread of the Christmas Truce of 1914, when soldiers on the Western Front put down their guns and exchanged food, gifts, and carols rather than blows. Tales like this one popularized the idea that Christmas time could be an almost miraculous period where people put aside their grudges, their ill wills, their political convictions, and allowed for just a moment of peace on earth. On the other hand, as the Great Depression ravaged the economy, the image of Santa Claus was hijacked in order to sell sugary drinks. In 1931, Coca-Cola commissioned an illustration of Santa Claus holding a bottle of Coca-Cola. Dressed all in red, jolly, and red-cheeked, they had hijacked nostalgia in order to move product. While Coca-Cola definitely didn't invent Santa, as a lot of lists and clickbait articles like to claim, they did solidify and popularize the image of him all in red, red-cheeked with a jolly disposition. Santa was becoming more and more of a recognizable figure, representing the genuine charitable concept of Christmas, as well as the cheap holiday veneer that consumerism was pushing. Santa was becoming more and more of a recognizable figure, representing both the genuine magic of the Christmas season and the cheap veneer of holiday cheer. There was something in Old Saint Nick for everybody. Both the religious and non-religious public could embrace a Santa who brought joy to children and families, who represented a spirit of giving and the non-judgmental warmth of good feeling among all people. Even business interests could add their encouragement, because Santa as a gift giver held so many commercial possibilities, and it all still served as a winter party, bringing lights and celebration in the midst of the cold and dark. With Santa's encouragement, the entire culture stopped for the Christmas parade. Throughout the 20th century, there was an absolute explosion of media focusing on Santa Claus. Author L. Frank Baum, best known for his Wizard of Oz series, wrote The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus in 1902. Filled with gnomes and pixies and fairies, this was a playful retelling of the formation of the Santa legend that reinforced a lot of existing notions about the character. Father Christmas was appearing everywhere, including in the writings of significant 20th century authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien. Although the collection of these letters was only published recently, from 1920 all the way into 1943, Tolkien wrote a letter from Father Christmas to his children every year. Although these at first were a rather simple affair, responding to his kids' requests for gifts and giving little updates about the North Pole, answering their questions, they quickly grew in size and scope, until they were a storytelling venture all of their own, including illustrations drawn by Tolkien himself. Tolkien speaks of Father Christmas's assistant, the mischievous polar bear, his elves and their unique languages, and their ongoing conflict with the wicked goblins. His Father Christmas was a celebration of the joy and brightness of the Christmas season, and a way for him to connect with his children through the art of fantasy. By the way, I have gotten a couple of people asking where my letters from Father Christmas video from 2 Christmases back went. I did have to take that down because of a copyright strike, so blame HarperCollins, not me. But if you would still like to watch it, it is available on my Patreon. So sorry about that, but unfortunately there was nothing I could do. One of Santa Claus's most contentious literary appearances is in C.S. Lewis's Narnia. Narnia follows a group of kids as they travel through a wardrobe and into a fantasy land, where it is notably always winter and never Christmas. Father Christmas finally appears to them in this winter wonderland, bearing gifts and news of brighter times to come. Everyone knew him because, though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talked about even in our world. the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it is rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look only funny and jolly, but now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad, so real, that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also solemn. "I've come at last," said he. "She has kept me out for a long time, but I have got in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening." And Lucy felt running through her that deep shiver of gladness, which you only get if you are being solemn and still. Father Christmas is given such a gravity here. Being an embodiment of the brighter side of winter, he is a herald of the eventual summer to come. All this time they've complained that it is always winter and never Christmas, but the arrival of Father Christmas means that the long dark has ended, and the light will soon be returning. But as I mentioned, this inclusion of Father Christmas within the fantasy world of Narnia has always been one of the most complained about things about C.S. Lewis's story. In fact, J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a good friend of C.S. Lewis, listed the inclusion of Father Christmas as one of his primary complaints. This is a fantasy world where, theoretically, technically, Christ doesn't exist. Christianity is not a thing, so how is Father Christmas there? And while I do get where people are coming from there, and I don't love it, I do think that the inclusion of Father Christmas within Narnia is a powerful representation of just what an important symbolic figure he had become. One of the things about Narnia is that it is a land in which all of our human, real-world mythical ideas are realized in real life. We get to see the great King Lion, the Faun, the Ice Queen. These storytelling tropes are realized to the fullest. The appearance of Father Christmas is representative of the way that he had entered the canon of mythology, a symbol far beyond his roots as a 4th century saint from Turkey. Santa was also fully being realized in the emerging media of film. Movies like the 1947 classic Miracle on 34th Street saw Santa Claus taking on the modern day. In Miracle on 34th Street, a man named Kris Kringle gets roped into playing Santa in the Macy's Day Parade, and it turns out he's actually pretty good at it. So good that they hire him on to be the Santa stand-in in Macy's for the whole season. As the film progresses, people begin to wonder if this Kris Kringle might just be the genuine article, and it culminates in a court case where a judge must decide once and for all if this man really is Santa Claus, and if miracles are possible. It is a sweet and wholesome movie that tackles the question of belief in Santa Claus in a very interesting way. Maybe, it suggests, Christmas is the one time of year where we can set aside our incredulity and cynicism and let belief, as silly and whimsical as it is, sweep us away. There were also a lot of movies at this time which expanded on the lore of Santa himself, and stop-motion animation was a really popular vehicle for this kind of story. We got Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in 1964, Santa Claus is Coming to Town in 1970, and an adaptation of The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus in 1985. These highly stylized, sweetly sentimental movies emphasized the now traditional Christmas values: generosity, family, kindness, and of course, Santa was the living embodiment of all of these. Of course, in the latter half of the 19th century, we also got a lot of comedies circling around the mythos of Santa. In The Santa Claus, a father accidentally kills Santa and finds himself contractually obliged to take his role. Elf follows a boy raised by elves at the North Pole, who is now a grown man trying to function in the real world. Santa had been done and redone by the end of the 20th century, and it was becoming clear just what a versatile tool he was. But that means that there was also some room for some cynicism, and perhaps a gentle critique of the Santa mythos. And who better to deliver that critique than Terry Pratchett? Best known for his long-running Discworld series, Terry Pratchett is well known for his ability to lovingly lambast and just completely destroy some very major fantasy tropes, and his take on Christmas and the Santa myth is one of my favorite Santa Claus adaptations. In his 1996 novel Hogfather, Terry Pratchett brings us down to the disc on Hogswatch Night, where the Hogfather rides around on his sleigh pulled by giant boars, delivering gifts to children that leave out turnips for the hogs pulling the sleigh, and a glass of sherry and a pork pie for the Hogfather. But this year is different. The Hogfather has gone missing, and realizing the importance of Hogswatch Night in order to maintain belief in the Hogfather, Pratchett's recurring character of Death dons the hat, takes the sleigh, and plays the role of Hogfather. The character of Death is literally death. He's the embodiment of all of the human imaginings around the figure of Death, so he's literally a skeleton in a long black robe with the scythe and everything. But Death is definitely not a villain. He's a protagonist in multiple books, and it is his perspective as someone who is not part of humanity, but is watching humanity and really loves humanity that makes this story so unique. As they say in the book, if you asked Death how to solve world hunger, rather than addressing the deep systematic problems or the governmental regulations you'd have to get through, Death would just give everybody in the world a plate of food. Taking on the role of the Hogfather, Death is able to rip into some of the most generally accepted but baffling traditions that are wrapped up in the Hogswatch season. When he sees the little girl selling matches in the snow, about to die of exposure, Death decides to save her. His servant Albert tries to explain that that's just not the done thing. The little match girl has to die. But the little match girl's dying in the snow is part of what the Hogwatch spirit is all about, Master, said Albert desperately. I mean, people hear about it and say, we may be poorer than a disabled banana and only have mud and old boots to eat, but at least we're better off than that poor little match girl, Master. It makes them feel happy and grateful for what they've got, see? But Death doesn't have our human biases and our predisposed notions, and so he saves the little match girl. Consequences be damned. Elsewhere on the disc that Hogswatch Night, a king has forced himself into the hovel of an old man and is trying to foist his dinner scraps onto this old man as an act of charity. The old man is baffled and upset. He just wants to eat the beans and sausages that he has. He's not used to this kind of luxury. Death, of course, charges into his rescue, ready to rip a hole in the concept of seasonal charity. What's going on here, whoever you are, is some fine old Hogswatch charity. And who? No, it's not. What? How dare you? Were you here last month? Will you be here next week? No. But tonight you wanted to feel all warm inside. Tonight you will want them to say, what a good king he is. Whatever it is, it's more than he's got, snapped the king. And all we've had from him is ingratitude. Yes, that does spoil it, doesn't it? Death leaned forward. Go away. Later on, Albert and Death have a conversation where Death is trying to explain that while Death's powers are limitless and he can summon everything, he still has to be careful with the gifts that he gives. Charity ain't giving people what you wants to give, it's giving people what they need to get. The world would be in a right mess if everybody got what they asked for, eh? It's the hope that's important. Big part of belief, hope. Give people jam today and they'll just sit and eat it. Jam tomorrow? Now that'll keep them going forever. And you mean that because of this, the poor get poor things, and the rich get rich things? That's right, said Albert. That's the meaning of Hogswatch. In the end, with the help of his granddaughter Susan, the villains are defeated, and the Hogfather is saved. The children's belief in the Hogfather is restored, and so the sun is able to rise on Hogswatch Day. Susan is curious, though, and she asks Death what would have happened to the sun if they hadn't saved the Hogfather. A mere ball of flaming gas would have illuminated the world. Susan is taken aback. You're saying humans need fantasies to make life bearable? Really? As if it was some kind of pink pill? No. Humans need fantasy to be human, to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. Tooth fairies? Hogfathers? Yes, as practice. You have to start out learning to believe the little ones, so we can believe the big ones. Yes, justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing. You need to believe in things that aren't true. How else can they become? The concept that Santa is a personification of belief and the need for belief is something that started coming up more and more in Santa Claus stories. Take, for example, 2004's The Polar Express, in which a boy is whisked off on a train adventure, all in the name of restoring his Christmas spirit. The train conductor warns him,
"But sometimes seeing is believing. And sometimes the most real things in the world are the things we can't see."
This belief is seen as something sacred, and I don't think it's incidental that this has become one of the most pervasive Santa Claus narrative these days. In an increasingly secular society, Santa is one of the last agreed upon deities that our culture has. He can represent almost anything: charity, goodwill, commercialism, corporate greed, but really, he represents the idea that there is something bigger than us. The idea that there is a spirit to Christmas. Sure, there's an understanding that Santa Claus is not real, probably, but we all still participate in the tenets of his faith. The adults may not believe, but they perform Santa's will on Earth. They are his willing disciples. They bring about his annual miracle. There is an inversion here. Adults behave as if Santa were true, and make him true in that performative sense. The presents arrive, and the magic of the ritual is preserved. Our personal disbelief seems to strengthen our ideological drive to make sure that others continue their belief, perhaps somewhat on our behalf, as part of the magic of Christmas, as adults continue to call it. Santa meshes perfectly well into religious celebrations of Christmas. He was, after all, originally a saint, but he also stands as one of the last remaining saints of our secular world. And in that role, he distills a lot of our cultural values. Whether Santa Claus represents generosity or greed, the way that we portray Santa Claus says a lot about who we are and what we believe. Media representations of Santa aren't just entertainment, and that is why one of my favorite adaptations of the Santa Claus story is 2019's Klaus. Klaus rewrites the Santa Claus story in a very unique and very moving way. In this animated film, a wayward postman is sent to the remote town of Smeerenburg in the hopes that he'll grow up a bit. And the postman, Jesper, at first is just miserable. The town of Smeerenburg is divided by a decades-old rivalry between two families. It's icy, unpleasant, made all the more miserable by the constant petty conflict. Jesper's only hope is to mail 6,000 letters to meet his goal, whereupon he will be rescued from Smeerenburg. His ventures take him to the home of the reclusive toy maker, Klaus, and the two strike up a bargain. Klaus sees how miserable the kids of the town are, and he wants to give them all of the toys that he's been making. And Jesper is willing to help along the way, so long as the kids are sending letters to Klaus. The kids, wanting to be seen as nice enough to be worthy of presents, begin performing acts of kindness, and through these small acts of kindness, slowly the division between the town's families are healed. Jesper begins to unlearn his selfishness, and Klaus opens up, and the two of them become close friends. They even befriend the local Sami people, who offer to help out making toys, and soon they have a whole workshop going. Klaus eventually reveals that he lost his wife and all hopes of having a family years ago. Since then, the toys were left waiting for someone to play with them. Through the friendship of Jesper, the Sami, and the townspeople, Klaus has found a new family, and he goes from being the frightening recluse to the jolly old saint in no time. It's a tale of healing, of generosity, and of the power of love.
Someone used to say, a true, selfless act always sparks another.
Klaus passes on, but some unspecified magic allows him to return every year, spreading gifts and truly selfless joy to everyone in the world. I absolutely adore this retelling of the Santa Claus myth. I think that it cuts through a lot of the more challenging parts of the Santa mythos, the confusing history, the commercialism, the more complicated implications of his role as a gift giver, and it gets right to the heart of the spirit of the Christmas season, the generosity and the desire for pure joy that first inspired St. Nicholas to toss those coins through that window. Christmas doesn't need to be a time of isolation, of burrowing closer into your cozy private home, your perfect nuclear family. It could be a time of reaching out, of acting selflessly in the hopes that that might spark selflessness and joy in another person. Stories and myths are not mere entertainment, and the holidays that we celebrate aren't just escapism. They say so much about who we are, and what we believe. There's something just so funny and kind of perfect about the fact that Santa Claus arose because a bunch of people sat in a room one time and went, "We should really make something like Santa." It's just so delightfully human. It is so human to want to believe in something larger than ourselves. That's why we've invented and reinvented religion time and time again, and whether he's naughty or nice, Santa Claus is a very powerful thing to believe in. While the holidays are probably more homogenous these days than they ever have been before, one of my favorite things about talking to people at this time of year is finding out what weird familial Christmas or holiday traditions they have. So in the comments, let me know what your nicest or your weirdest Christmas tradition is. Now that I've learned about all of these new, old Christmas traditions, I do feel like I need to cover all my bases. So maybe this year on top of the milk and cookies, I'll also leave out some rice porridge for the tomte or some turnips for the Hogfather. By the time I'm done developing new Christmas traditions, there's just gonna be a whole feast laid out for whoever comes down the chimney. Before the new year, I do plan on going onto my Patreon and doing a little Q&A holiday reading of my favorite Christmas story and a mini state of the channel address. So if you want to be there for that, go ahead and check that out, linked in the description. I will be posting one more video before the new year on the 27th, but this will be my last video before the 25th, so I just wanted to take this chance to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays. Subscribe if you'd like to stick around, and consider giving this video a like as a little present to me, because that's all I want for Christmas. But thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hoppity day.